quasi dem Matthias eine Telefonnummer gehabt, aber das kann ja eben dann ein Anruf bei Handy oder
Well, hello everyone. I'm really glad to be here. I'm glad you've started to talk to each other as well. The point of today is to hear your feedback, to hear your questions. So I really look forward to your skeptical questions. And as I'm talking, please do think about those. Feel free to write those down. Submit them to the app if you'd like. We'll also take verbal questions if you want to do that. So today's topic, naturalism, Christianity, two of the biggest worldviews available to you to choose between today. Christianity, the world's largest religion. Naturalism, maybe the most popular worldview in Austria and in the Western world. And a lot of people think that there's a really sharp split between facts and faith. And that's what underlies the appeal of naturalism. Naturalism, a lot of people think, is about facts, sciencey things like on the left, and faith is kind of vague, not specified, not really related to facts, kind of castles in the air or Luftschlösser, like that. Is that what you think about facts and faith? Hopefully we'll find out later today. Now, also closely tied to naturalism is the appeal of science. So to start my talk, I'll talk a little bit about science and the bases, the reasons that people think they have for believing in naturalism. So before I kind of critique naturalism, I want to try and give a fair account of it. And in the Q&A, you can let me know if that account was fair. And then I'll try and give an explanation of the Christian alternative to naturalism. I think science is awesome. This is the kind of thing that I study, bacterial transcription on the left and translation on the right. And this is what most of my work is about. So turning DNA into RNA and then into proteins. My particular research, just in case you're curious, is about a specific kind of gene called an overlapping gene. So you've got a gene pictured up there on the top left, and it turns out that you can have other genes embedded within genes like that. So this is one example in the antisense. You directly opposite to the first gene, you could conceivably have a second small gene encoded. And it turns out that there's lots of these in viruses and in bacteria and in other places. And this is what I research. So I research the evidence for them in terms of their translation, which is called ribosome profiling, like this. And I also research the structure of the genetic code and how that facilitates overlapping genes. So it turns out this remarkable embedded, encoded information. We have multiple layers of information. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in how many are there, how many overlapping genes are there, how did they evolve, how do they change over time, how do they originate, can we work that out, and what applications could they have? So it turns out they might be useful in synthetic biology, they might be useful just in understanding the genome better, and potentially these cool new proteins that we're finding could have applications. So that's the kind of science that I do, but for most of today I'll be talking about science in a more kind of general sense. And when you think about naturalism, Christianity, science, related to this is this common idea that there's this really sharp split between sciencey stuff and the humanities or the soft sciences or the social sciences. And a lot of people think that this kind of just a bridge that can't be crossed. And one of the messages of today is I think there is a way to cross that, and I think Christianity maybe helps. But I look forward to seeing what you think about that. So is there a great divide, like a lot of people think? Facts and faith, like I've said before. Science and religion. Behaviors and values. Reality, which is real, versus imagination, which is not. History, which is something that happened. And poetry, which is something that didn't. The brain, which is real, and the mind, which is something else, something kind of mysterious. So a lot of people think that there is this really sharp split, but they think the things on the left are real, and the things on the right are appealing, but not really real. And if you think that the things on the left are real and the only things that exist, then you're basically a naturalist. This is what naturalists believe, that the real stuff is the stuff on the left, and the stuff on the right is kind of, well, it's not real. And one major alternative with Christianity and some other religious systems is that both of these things are real. So it's not a left versus right thing. It's not that naturalists believe that things on the left are real, Christians believe that things on the right are real, and that's it. But my claim today is that with Christianity, you get both. So if you want both, then maybe Christianity is an option to consider. Okay, so what is naturalism? This is a nice summary, I think, from Carl Sagan. The cosmos, that's the universe, is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. In other words, naturalism is the idea that only nature exists. And if only nature exists, and the way you come to know stuff about nature is through science, then only really science is going to be helpful in working out what's real. So naturalism pretty quickly leads to scientism, or the idea that only science is a legitimate way to truth. And if only science is a legitimate way to truth, only natural science, then you've ruled out a bunch of stuff. You've ruled out history, you've ruled out theology, and you've ruled out philosophy and other things. So if you're a naturalist, it's hard, at least, to not fall into this kind of trap of thinking that only science will tell you what's real, what's in reality. Why would people believe this? For a lot of people, it might seem kind of strange. Like, obviously, the things on the right before, some of those things seem real. So why would people believe in naturalism? And there's three, at least, kind of major arguments I'll quickly summarize, so you get a sense of what naturalists believe, why they believe it, and hopefully if you're a naturalist, you'll agree, or you'll kind of resonate with this. You go, yeah, that's what I believe. That's what I'm hoping to start with. So the first argument, which people kind of have, actually, I should say before I do that, a lot of people don't have arguments for naturalism, of course. They just believe it because their parents believed it, or they were kind of taught it in school, or they just picked it up. But if you're trying to work out what's true, it's helpful to have arguments. It's helpful to have reasons for what you believe. And these are the kinds of reasons that people give. So the first one is that science is really successful. And this is probably something that most people will agree with. Science works incredibly well. One of the main examples, which is really impressive when you think about the numbers, is the success of vaccines. So vaccines have saved millions of lives every year over the last century or so. Some estimates say maybe 5 million lives per year since the 1980s, just in the case of smallpox. So many millions of people have been saved through science, through vaccines. This is a very concrete thing. I mean, it's, okay, science is super successful. That's a reason to believe in science. Science works so well in this case, in other case, technology, flying us to the moon. Why shouldn't it work everywhere? Why not just believe in science? This is what a lot of people will say. Richard Dawkins has a kind of example of this. He's a famous evolutionary biologist based at Oxford and a naturalist. And he says that science has eradicated smallpox, can immunize against most previously deadly viruses, can kill most previously deadly bacteria. Theology has done nothing but talk of pestilence, that's disease, as the wages of sin. So science is useful, theology is useless. That's his message, and a lot of people agree with it. It kind of makes sense. Yeah, science is useful. What's theology done for me? So this is the first argument, that science is super successful. Why not just believe it? The second argument is that science is progressing. So over time, science is kind of moving forward. It's filling in the gaps. There's a famous cartoon, various equations on the left, various equations on the right, things we understand, and in the middle there's a gap, and we just say, well, then a miracle occurs. And the suggestion is, well, maybe you should be a little bit more careful, a little bit more explicit here in step 2. And this is what science is doing. A lot of people saying, okay, we used to believe in miracles, there are a few gaps, we're filling them in, science is moving forward. One day, science will fill in all the gaps, and then theology will have nowhere to hide, and that will be the end of theology. So that's a very common belief, that's the suggestion. Science has displaced other forms of knowledge. As science gets bigger, God gets smaller. Our concept of God gets smaller, at least. As science continues to advance, therefore atheism must as well, because less of God means more atheism. So that's maybe the second major kind of argument, idea that people have for why they should believe in naturalism. And the third big one, maybe the biggest one, is the problem of evil. And this is obviously a huge discussion. It would be a whole talk to think about carefully. I'm sure you can all think of examples of evil that really particularly resonate or grip you or come to mind. War is obviously a big one. This is a photo of some Australian soldiers, I think, in World War I, and in a place where thousands of them were slaughtered. So there's numerous examples of this, of things that seem kind of senseless in history, that seem evil, and the question is, well, how would a good God permit this kind of stuff to happen? How could it be true that there is a good God, and yet all this seemingly pointless, random, evil stuff, suffering, disease, despair, and war? So this is a major kind of argument that people have for why they might believe in naturalism. And that's the third one. Okay, hopefully that was a fair, really quick summary of why a lot of people do believe in naturalism, so that you've got kind of one side of the story now. And I think you've probably heard a lot of that kind of side of the story through the media, through education, through the internet, through stuff you've read. So the main task of today is to give you the other side of the story and to see what you think about it. As I'm talking, please do ask questions. All questions are fine. And I won't have all the answers, but hopefully I'll have something interesting to say. So here's 3 reasons why I think you should consider Christianity, which are pretty closely related to the 3 reasons that people might offer for why they believe in naturalism. Firstly, the success of science, and secondly, the story of the history of science, and then thirdly, what could be called the problem of good and evil. So the first one I'll talk through for a little bit is why science is successful. So not just that it is successful, but why it is. Here's one quote, which is relevant, from Johannes Kepler, who actually was based in Graz for some of his life. He said, he was a Christian and a scientist, and he said, geometry is one and eternal, shining in the mind of God. That share in it accorded to men, in other words, that part that humanity's been given, is one of the reasons that man is the image of God. Geometry is one and eternal, shining in the mind of God. So, in other words, there's this kind of mathematical basis to reality, and Kepler thinks that that's grounded in the mind of God. And the fact that we can have access to that is because we are made in the image of God. This is a really interesting suggestion, and it raises a bunch of questions of what is mathematics, why does it apply to the real world, and why do we have anything to do with it? As animals evolved through completely unintentional processes, why would we have access to the fundamental nature of reality? This is kind of surprising. If you're a naturalist, seems maybe a little bit less surprising if you think that God made us in his image and made the world according to a mathematical blueprint. And that's what the early scientists thought to a large extent. So this issue is the success of science. Why does science work? Particularly, why can we have this amazing precision in mathematical descriptions of nature? It turns out that science actually assumes a whole bunch of stuff. In order to do science, you need to believe a bunch of stuff about the world. And each of these, I think, is kind of surprising if you're a naturalist. And I'll briefly talk through each of them. So firstly, science assumes that this universe exists. I mean, that's kind of obvious. Everyone assumes that. But the important thing here is the universe could be different. So the universe, which could be different, exists. That's fairly important for science because we're going out there and testing how is the universe? What is the way that the universe is? So another word for that is the universe is contingent. It could be different. If you're a naturalist, it's not clear why that should be. The theistic account is that God chose this universe to be a particular way, and that's why it's contingent, because he had different options and he chose one. But if you're a naturalist, why was this universe chosen rather than any of the other ones? There's no real reason. You're just left with this universe, and kind of a mystery of why it's this one and not one of the other ones that it could have been. So that's kind of surprising if you're a naturalist. The second major surprise, the universe has a kind of order. An example of that is the electrons in this desk and the matter in this room have exactly the same property as electrons 2 billion light years in that direction, or that direction, or that direction. So there's this cosmic order throughout the whole universe. Every single particle of the same type has basically the same properties. This is remarkable. This is not something that people would have believed until pretty recently. Why does the whole universe follow the same relatively simple order? This is surprising, but it makes sense if there's kind of some kind of cosmic cause behind the universe. There's something that unites the universe. So the universe is not just chaos. It's not just everything is different, but there's an underlying order of some kind. Then even more surprising is the kind of order that this universe has is law-like. It's like laws. This is what the early scientists thought. They actually thought it's like a king makes laws in his country, and God makes laws in his universe. And that's why they came up with the idea of natural law, because they thought God was like a king over the whole universe. Law-like means that it's the order in the universe is prescriptive. It makes stuff happen. And this is a special kind of order, which it turns out naturalists find really hard to explain. If you're interested in that, there's an atheist philosopher called Nancy Cartwright, and she has a paper called No God, No Laws. So she thinks you need to get rid of natural law if you're an atheist. And there's a bunch of atheists who think that the concept of natural law is so tied in to the Christian history of science that maybe we actually need to get rid of it, which would completely change science. The fourth thing is that maybe the most surprising is that we can actually understand it. There's this mysterious order through the whole universe, and it's somehow like laws, like commands, but we can actually understand it. This is hugely surprising. Why should we, creatures evolved through a purposeless process on planet Earth, a speck of dust in one corner of the universe, why should we be able to understand the origin of the universe, the smallest particles, the largest objects in the universe, when we evolved to survive? We evolved to run away from lions, chase antelopes, and survive. This is hugely mysterious, and a lot of atheist scientists have said this is surprising. But if you believe that the mind of God created the universe and created us in his image, it's not so surprising. So a similar concept, C.S. Lewis, the former Oxford professor, Cambridge professor, I think, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So that nicely summarizes part of the background, the historical background to science. People went into studying the natural world in this way because they expected that they would get something useful out of it. And a lot of cultures didn't actually expect that. Why would you expect that if you think the world is chaos? Or why would you expect that if you think the world is ultimately one? There's just one kind of rational principle behind it, and there's no contingency, there's not necessarily diversity. So there's been major philosophical problems that have stopped science in the past, but it's in the Christian tradition that science really got going. There's a bunch of reasons for that. Some of them I've kind of touched on. Firstly, that the laws of science are God's because he's king of the universe. So it's, like I said, a king or queen makes laws in their country, and God makes laws for the universe. Secondly, and this is important, God wants us to understand the universe, and that gives science a purpose. That means science is worth doing on a Christian worldview. For a naturalist, it's actually not clear why is science worth doing, other than maybe practical benefits. Maybe it helps with healthcare or something. But science for its own sake, just all you've got is just kind of curiosity. And if you happen to be curious about it, you do science. If you're not, you don't. It doesn't matter. But if you have a Christian worldview, then there's a good reason to do science because he made the world and he made us in his image. He made the world good. So there's a good reason to want to explore what God has made. And then one of the last important things in the rise of science is that we need to test things. This is maybe the main thing that gave rise to modern science is the experimental method. And there's a bunch of historians who've argued that there's some theological reasons for why we need to test things, and that helped justify the rise of science and why it really expanded so rapidly in Europe around the 17th century. And the first reason that God could have made things differently. So we need to work out why did he make it, or which way did he make it? And secondly, we're broken, we're sinful. This is the idea of original sin or some theological idea like that. And that means we can't fully trust our senses or intuitions. If we can't trust them, that means we need to test them. We need to check what's actually real. We need to talk to other people. We need to do experiments together. So God could have made things differently, and we need to check what he actually did make. And this gave rise to maybe the central part of early modern science. Kepler, again, while he was living in Graz, he wrote this letter to the Bavarian chancellor, and he said that those laws are within the grasp of the human mind. God wanted us to recognize them by creating us after his own image so that we could share in his own thoughts. And that was his theological basis for the amazing science that he did. And a lot of early scientists and scientists right up to today have the same motivation, the same understanding for why they do science. So I think, in summary, there's both historical and philosophical reasons to think there's some kind of useful connection between Christianity and science that naturalism really doesn't have. Hopefully, you've got some questions about that. Okay. Another major issue is the problem of good and evil. And a famous claim from Dostoevsky is that if there is no God, everything is permitted. And we can definitely talk about that. There's a few components of this issue of good and evil I want to go through. The first is it real? Is there a moral reality? If you believe in human rights, then I think the correct answer for you would be to say yes, you do believe in a moral reality. And most people in Austria probably would say they believe in human rights, but they might be less sure on whether they believe in a moral reality. How do we make sense of this moral reality? Why is it that there's some things we should do and some things we shouldn't do? On a naturalistic view, there's just things that happen, things that don't happen. But where do we get the should from? Where do we get the idea that some things are obligatory or permitted or forbidden? The whole concept of something being permitted is a personal concept. It requires a mind to explain it. What kind of mind explains universal human rights? The suggestion might be, well, maybe a universal mind, maybe a mind that's bigger than individual humans. This was a strong influence on this particular declaration. There was a number of Christians who contributed to it, and they believe that there is a God who's made us, and that gives us value, that God has chosen certain things that we should do or that we shouldn't do, and that's the basis for rights and for duties as well. And the second thing, okay, maybe there's some kind of moral reality out there. I'm not sure how it got there, but maybe there is. The next question for the naturalist would be, well, how would we know what it was? There's all kinds of moral systems that you could invent. Why should we believe one rather than another? Again, if you believe in a naturalistic account of evolution, then there's really no purpose behind that process. We evolved to survive. Our moral beliefs and behaviors are those which led to us surviving. Why should that connect with moral truth, even if there was moral truth? So this is called an evolutionary debunking argument. It's a skeptical argument. If naturalistic evolution is true, then there's nothing pointing our beliefs and behaviors towards truth rather than towards survival. There's no reason to think they're going in the same direction. So that should give us some doubt about our moral beliefs. Just because we believe something, just because we tend to behave in a certain way, that doesn't mean it's right. That doesn't mean it's good. That doesn't mean it's valuable. So this is a major challenge for someone who thinks that There's no purpose behind the way that we're created. So that's the second thing. The first was, do moral facts even exist in the first place? The second is, well, how do we come to know them? There's a third one, that morality actually makes sense in a practical sense. And here's a gap for the naturalist. So the previous gap was between survival and truth for moral knowledge. And this gap is between stuff that's right and stuff that makes us happy. And if you're a naturalist, there's no guarantee at all that these things will go together. I think often in our experience, we'll see that they seem to separate. The thing which is hard to do, but right, goes in a different direction to the thing that seems easy and probably make us happy, probably give us kind of easy satisfaction. So saving the drowning child in the pond, I mean, that might make us happy in some sense, but it's also an inconvenience. Or just going out of our way to help people every day. Eventually it becomes difficult. And just kind of avoiding people who need help, that would maybe make us happier. But so again, these things are splitting. So you can probably think of all kinds of ways in which the right and the thing that leads to happiness, they're going in different directions if you're a naturalist. If you're a theist, there's a way that they could actually come together. If God has made us a certain way, and he's made us such that doing right is for our good, and there's an afterlife where there will be judgment, then it's possible that happiness and goodness or justice can actually come together. Without some kind of cosmic mind, some kind of cosmic purpose behind the scenes, these roads are just going to keep separating from each other. So this is a major gap for the naturalist. And this is important because it helps us to think whether we should bother following moral commands. Even if there were moral commands and we knew what they were, well, why should we care if we were a naturalist? If happiness says go in the other direction, why don't we just go in the other direction? There's no ultimate consequence for that. There's no concept of justice. There's no obligation, and there's no practical reason to follow through with morality, even if somehow it existed and we knew what it was. So this is the third thing, a practical thing, that morality actually makes sense if you believe in a good God who loved us and made us such that pursuing the good is actually for our well-being, for our flourishing in the end. And if you're the naturalist, you're kind of stuck in the middle, confused, which way should you go? And then the last thing, my last comment on the problem of good, the problem of evil, is that at least on the theistic picture, there's some kind of hope of an answer to the problem of evil. If you're an atheist, there's no answer. Okay, there's suffering, there's evil, stuff happens, and then we die, and that's it. If you're a theist, then there's the hope of justice. There's the hope of some kind of justice. There's the hope of an afterlife. There's the hope of God renewing things and making things better. So this is kind of, again, a practical benefit or a practical advantage of theism is that it gives a place, it recognizes that evil is bad, is genuinely bad, and it gives a place for hope in the future. It gives a place for kind of making sense of evil and coming to grips with it. Whereas if you're an atheist, it's just kind of, well, one random thing happens, it could have been another thing, and that's all there is to it. Richard Dawkins says something like, basically, you either get lucky or you don't, and that's it. Okay, so far I've looked at the idea of science and how this fits with Christianity and naturalism, and then the idea of ethics, the good and evil question. So to come towards a close, we want to go back to the start, this idea of the gap between facts and faith, behaviors and values, science and religion. Again, if you're a naturalist, you think basically just the stuff on the left is real. And if you're a Christian, my claim is that you can have both. I want to try and examine how you can have both on the Christian view. So firstly, I think it's controversial but useful to say that naturalism is actually a faith position. So naturalism is a worldview that people trust, and that's all that faith means. And my suggestion is that it's actually not very well grounded. A lot of people think naturalism naturalism is kind of the rigorous, evidential, logical, analytical view, but there's a lot of problems with it. A major problem is it's not even clear what naturalism is. So you say, okay, naturalism is only nature exists. That's good for a start, but what is nature? What counts as natural and what counts as not natural? Well, nature is what science studies. Okay, well, but science keeps on moving forward every day. The science of today is different than the science of 10 years ago. So is it what science says exists today? But that's going to change tomorrow. So does naturalism change tomorrow? Does what counts as natural change tomorrow? What if science discovered that God existed? Would God become natural? Would you be a naturalist if you suddenly believed in God, if science told you that God existed? So it's not even clear what naturalism says. Most philosophers who are naturalists will end up saying, well, it's what the science of the future will tell us, what the perfect science will tell us. But what's that? Who knows? Maybe God's part of that perfect science. So there's no clear split of what naturalism is. The best definition that I've come across is given by a Christian philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, and it's basically that naturalism is the claim that there's no God and nothing like God. So there's no God and nothing like God, and that's what naturalism is. So really naturalism is atheism, and it's hard to separate the two. So naturalism is the rejection of the idea that there is a God, or something like God. And that seems the best definition. But it's not entirely clear. And on the other hand, the Christian position is actually very well defined. There's been centuries of Christians thinking carefully and defining their beliefs in the major creeds, in the councils of the church, in the major Christian writings. So Christians have a pretty good idea of what they believe in some detail. Naturalists, well, actually that keeps changing every year when science changes. Naturalism is always kind of updating itself in light of what we're finding. Whereas the Christians haven't changed their belief for the last 2,000 years, which seems maybe an advantage. Okay, so naturalism is a faith position, but on the other hand, Christianity is based on evidence. And I've briefly summarized some of the evidence today. The first kind is natural evidence or scientific evidence, or evidence from nature. The second kind is moral evidence. There's a whole bunch of moral arguments. I gave you 3 or 4 of those today. Different classes of moral arguments. And the last one, which I haven't really gone into, is the historical evidence. And there's a bunch of that as well. So, which we can definitely talk through throughout the week. So naturalism is a faith position, but Christianity is based on a whole bunch of evidence. And further, maybe the central difference actually between naturalism and theism, and particularly Christianity, is that Christianity claims that the fundamental reality, at the bottom of the universe, we find a person. At the very ground level, reality is personal. Whereas on naturalism, reality is fully impersonal. There's no well, at least it's hard to find a place for minds as distinct from brains, and it's hard to find a place for persons at all, but particularly at the lowest level, that's definitely impersonal if you're a naturalist. It's just subatomic particles or whatever physics tells you there is. Whereas on the Christian view, the fundamental reality, the most significant, the most important reality is personal. Some implications of that, or some things that come out of that, is this helps us to make sense of these different classes of evidence that we've talked through before. If the fundamental reality is personal, that helps us make sense of the specific way the world is, because a person can choose. A person can choose one way or another way. So in terms of science, that means God chose to create a particular thing. Also, if the fundamental reality is personal, that makes sense of moral stuff, because moral commands are personal commands. They're like promises or duties or obligations. These are personal things. So morality seems personal. I think the foundations of science also seem personal, like laws. And then lastly, the claim that helps to explain the historical evidence is that God is personal. He is personally spoken. So God chooses to create. That makes sense of the nature of the world. It also makes sense of why we should do one thing rather than another thing, because he chose a particular way to make the world. He's given specific moral commands in terms of our nature, our conscience, but then he's also given us specific details that he has spoken. He's revealed himself personally. Okay, so back to this vaccine issue that Richard Dawkins raised. He said that science has given us the cure to smallpox and theology has given us nothing really useful. Well, what did the founder of modern vaccinations think about this issue? I think it's an interesting question. So that's Edward Jenner. What did he say about the relationship between his scientific discovery of vaccinations and theology? Did he think that science saves us and theology is useless? Maybe not. He said, "I'm not surprised that men are not thankful to me, but I wonder that they're not grateful to God for the good which he has made me the instrument of conveying to my fellow creatures." In other words, for him, the proper response to his discovery of vaccination, which Richard Dawkins attributes to science and says theology had nothing to do with, for the actual discoverer, the proper response was gratefulness to God. That helps make sense of why he did his science. He was motivated to help people who made in the image of God. Helps make sense of the purpose of doing science. Helps to make sense of why the science makes sense, to the rationality behind the universe. And it helps to make sense of the proper response to the scientific discovery is gratefulness to God. And then finally, a specifically Christian aspect of the fundamental reality being personal is that God has personally revealed himself in Jesus. A particularly interesting example of this is in relation to, well, how did Jesus treat skeptics? How did Jesus treat people who were doubtful about him? And there's a famous event where one of his disciples is doubting Thomas, and Jesus was very gracious and personal and accepting of that, and responded by showing him that he had actually risen from the dead. So the nature of God is personal, is not just this abstract, God made the universe, God gives moral laws, but really specific and historical and concrete in the person of Jesus, including how he directly responded to skeptics, to those who were doubtful of his claims. So the fundamental reality as personal goes all the way through, from creation, through conscience, and finally in the person of Jesus himself. Okay, so if the fundamental reality of the world is personal, I think that helps to make sense of a lot of the stuff that we already believe. And if the fundamental reality is not personal, then we're left with a bunch of mysteries. So in conclusion, Christianity helps to make sense of the world and gives us a motivation to do the stuff that we care about, like science. And that's one of the fundamental differences between Christianity and naturalism. So on that point, I close, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Ja, ich denke, das war sehr interessant und da war sehr viel drin und deshalb geben wir euch jetzt noch einen Moment, ein bisschen runterzukommen, gern nochmal mit euren Nachbarn zu diskutieren, wie ihr den Vortrag fandet und euch schon mal wieder auf Mentimeter anzumelden und noch ein paar Fragen reinzuschreiben. Wir haben zwischendrin immer mal geschaut, es sind schon sehr interessante Fragen dabei. Schreibt ruhig noch weiter rein, nehmt euch ruhig noch ein paar Minuten Zeit, darüber nachzudenken, was für euch offen geblieben ist. Und nachher wird es dann auch, wenn es gleich weitergeht, in ein paar Minuten, gibt es auch die Möglichkeit, dass ihr einfach on the spot, einfach sobald euch was einfällt, für euch aufrufen und dass ihr dann nochmal eine Frage persönlich stellt.
Genau, und wenn eine Frage schon in Mentimeter ist, die euch auch interessiert, könnt ihr einfach einen Daumen nach hoch geben, dann rückt das weiter rauf bei uns. Genau, also kurz drüber nachdenken, noch ein paar Fragen stellen. Wir fangen gleich mit der Fragerunde an. Gut, hat jemand aus dem Publikum schon eine Frage, die er so stellen möchte? Dann haben wir jetzt die Möglichkeit. Sonst beginnen wir mit den Fragen. Und zwar schon gleich an erster Stelle mit 9 upwards. Are there really leading scientists who are Christians?
Sure. Thanks. Sure, there's plenty of leading scientists who are Christians. Yeah, I've been privileged. There's a number of them in Germany and a number in Europe and in the UK. I've been privileged to meet a number of them. Yeah. One of the world's top scientists is Dr. Francis Collins. He's the head of the National Institutes of Health, which is the world's largest biomedical funding agency. He became a Christian at around the age 30 as an adult because he was confronted with the question, what do you believe? He was kind of agnostic before that. He hadn't thought that much about it. But someone asked him personally, one of his patients, he was training to be a doctor, and he was asked the question, what do you believe? And that kind of led to a little journey for him, and he did some reading, talked to lots of people. He read C.S. Lewis, who I quoted before, and he became a Christian through that. He's one of the founders of modern molecular genetics, and also led the Human Genome Project before, for a number of years, being the director of the National Institutes of Health. So that's in biology. In physics, there's heaps of them. George Ellis is one. He's one of the world's leading cosmologists. He's done a bunch of work with Stephen Hawking. In chemistry, there's a guy called Fritz Schaefer, who's one of the world's most cited chemists. So those are just 3 in biology, physics, and chemistry. But I could list probably 20 or 30 or so who are leading scientists. One of them, actually, I'll talk about in my talk on Wednesday. He's a chemist called John Goodenough. He just won the Nobel Prize about 2 weeks ago. So he's fairly good at what he does. He's 97. He's still active in research. He's 97 years old. He's still active in research. He's still inventing. So he invented the lithium-ion battery that's in my computer, your cell phones. He was also influential in discovering or in inventing RAM memory for computers. And he's still inventing new kinds of battery at the age of 97. And he became a Christian also as an adult, actually, through reading the Bible for himself, being involved in a Bible study in his late 20s. So that's another example. And he just won the Nobel Prize a couple of weeks ago.
Ja, vielen Dank. Wir haben noch eine Frage, die so ein bisschen in dieselbe Richtung geht, denke ich. Und zwar fragt hier jemand auch 9 upvotes. How's Christianity the only way to combine both facts and faith, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be clear, that wasn't really my claim today. I was just comparing Christianity and naturalism. To say that Christianity is the best theistic worldview would take a bit more work. You need to go through and compare what alternatives people might offer. I think it does have a bunch of advantages over some other worldviews. And one of them is that Christianity is particularly personal. Some other religions, God is very distant. We don't really know what God is like. He hasn't really revealed himself. He could do one thing, he could do another thing. One of the major world religions, you can maybe guess what it is, describes God as the greatest possible deceiver. The greatest possible deceiver. So God could lie. We don't know. We can't. He's not necessarily trustworthy. He doesn't make personal promises that he keeps. Whereas in Christianity, he does. And if God is trustworthy, that gives us more reason to trust the world that he's made as rational. The idea that, so in the Bible, I think in the book of Isaiah or Jeremiah, I'm not sure, it talks about God making the seasons in a particular regular way because God is faithful. And the regularities of the universe reflect God's personal faithfulness and his personal covenant with Israel. And so this is also behind the idea of laws of nature in the modern world. Because God is trustworthy and faithful, we can trust that his universe will also be rational and consistent. And other religions don't necessarily have that. So that's one answer. But the details would take a while to work through depending on what alternatives people might offer.
Gut, zur nächsten Frage. How can Christianity have both naturalism and Christianity when naturalism is equal to atheism? Can a Christian be an atheist?
No, I don't think a Christian can be an atheist. But my claim wasn't that you get naturalism if you're a Christian, but my claim was that you get natural stuff. So if you remember my faith, that's fine. If you remember my faith facts split, on the left was facts and science and behaviors. On the right was faith and religion and values. My point was you get both of these lists if you're a Christian, and you only get the left-hand list if you're a naturalist. The difference with naturalism is naturalism claims that's all there is. The left-hand list is everything there is in reality, whereas in Christianity you get that plus more. That's the advantage. Actually, I'm sure there must be questions from the audience that people would be happy to just ask. Something I've said that's you disagree with, you want clarified? Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, so just you tell me if I get your question right. But to summarize the question, firstly, I didn't really give detailed arguments, and secondly, on the good versus evil issue, the claim was that Christianity gives you hope and naturalism doesn't. But if Christianity does give you hope, then why not just have that hope now? Why do we have to deal with the suffering first? Is that a good summary? Yeah. Yeah, so this is a question that's been discussed way back to the ancient Greeks, well before Christianity. If God is good and all-powerful, why do we have bad stuff? And the short answer is we don't know, but one part of that answer is, should we expect to know? Should we expect to know reasons that God has to permit one thing or another thing? That's not so clear when you really think about it. And there's a huge philosophical literature on this. It's called skeptical theism. And it's gone back and forth, particularly in the last few decades. And a lot of atheists have kind of accepted there's kind of a stalemate there. We don't really know if we should expect to know God's reasons for doing one thing or another thing. The point with my suggestion there was just that there is some kind of answer in the end, and it's not just that you don't have hope, it's particularly you don't have moral hope, you don't have hope of justice if you're a naturalist. There's no concept of justice that really makes sense across people. So that's a major problem, because most naturalists believe in justice, but they have no grounding for it. And so that's a problem. And if it's true that there is justice, that's very strong evidence that naturalism is false. So that's one argument, and just in my defense for the first part, I think I did give some other arguments. I just didn't go through the details that I guess I could have to come to the other talks. But just quickly, just quickly, one list of arguments I kind of skipped through, these ones. So the first one is a reference to the cosmological argument. There's a huge philosophical literature on that. The second is an argument that's called eutaxiological, or ordering in the universe. There's also literature on that. And the third is a version of that the order is law-like. And then the fourth one is the comprehensibility. And there's a literature on each of these things, which we could, give a talk on. But I think those are the places to go if you want the detailed arguments. One person who's covered most of those and some other things is Richard Swinburne, a philosopher at Oxford, and he's really goes through the detail. But each of these requires a book-length treatment to give it the time it deserves. Yeah, thank you. In the middle? Oh, sorry, there was a question in the front, and then, yeah. So do you mean that a lot of scientists think that science conflicts with Christianity? Okay. I think it's true to some extent, but I think they're not really the people to go with, because it's a philosophical question. And a lot of scientists do very bad philosophy. One example is Stephen Hawking, great scientist, but he said philosophy is dead. And then he wrote a whole book about, you can guess what, he wrote a book about philosophy. So philosophy is dead, but then he writes a book that addressing philosophical questions without science, but really philosophical way. So a lot of people do think there is a conflict between science and faith, but it's a philosophical question, and I think the philosophers are a lot more careful on it. And I think it's been shown that really there isn't a conflict. Historically, it's a myth, and it's accepted by pretty much all historians, that there is a myth of the conflict between science and religion as an historical claim. And then as a philosophical claim, I think that's also false. And there's good reasons to think that the proper philosophical basis of science is something like theism rather than naturalism. So that's my quick answer. Yeah. And then in the middle.
Yeah, I wanted to add something to the context.
Sure.
Because I think like there was this free will, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think what's in Christianity, we assume God is bringing justice to us, is actually just a result of our own deeds, which we can decide what to do, and either they can coherent with certain universal orders, which will bring a good result for us, or not.
So the suggestion is, well, maybe free will solves the kind of evil problem. Is that the idea?
No. I mean that we have the decision to make good deeds in order to get a good result, and often forget about the deeds which create the bad result.
Yeah, so I think that's not going to be a full answer, because there's two kinds of evil. There's kind of personal or human evils, or moral evil, or personal evils, which might be related to free will in some cases. And then there's natural evils, which don't seem to relate very closely to free will. So natural evil is generally thought to be a bigger problem. Things like just natural disasters and things that do cause suffering for humans. And that's why I appealed to the fact that we don't know God's plans for the universe. You can start to find some hints and some directions. This is called the study of theodicy, and again, there's a huge literature on that. There's all kinds of suggestions for some ways in which things which are bad still at least have some plausible reason for why they're allowed to occur. So one example is earthquakes or volcanoes. These are really useful for the planet. This is not the full answer at all for why these things happen, but you can get a little sense of some reason for why God might permit these things. Without earthquakes and volcanoes, you don't get the cycling of nutrients and minerals that the earth needs to sustain life over the long term. That's just one example. But so the problem of natural evil is the big problem. But as I kind of said before, naturalism doesn't have an answer either. It just says, well, some stuff happens, it doesn't. There's not even really natural evil, there's just suffering. There's no real wrongness about it. That's my claim. Okay, maybe we go back to the app, and then if people have more questions, we can pursue that.
So we got a really deep question. Mm-hmm. It says, you said, if we're just here to survive, then morals makes no sense. What if morals are just the insight that working together and taking care of one another makes surviving easier?
Okay, so this is maybe kind of an evolutionary account of ethics, that we evolved in a kind of social system, so looking after each other kind of makes sense. I would say, well, my short answer to that is it's not really talking about morality, because morality is about obligation. And this kind of naturalistic evolutionary account gives you no obligation. It says it tends to work out better for you if you do this. It doesn't say you ought to. There's no ought there. There's no should. There's no have to. There's no obligation. It's just this behavior tends statistically to lead to this kind of result. And that's just not talking about morality. It's just talking about pragmatic, rational decisions that people make in order to get ahead in life. And often the moral thing to do is a thing that's not practically rational. Like I kind of said before, it's the split between happiness and the good or the right. So an evolutionary account of ethics in this way is probably not really going to get you to ethics. It's just going to get you to behaviors that might help you in some ways. But it's not dealing with the philosophical problem of why are there genuine rights and wrongs. It kind of just gets around it and basically implies that there aren't any, but we can still do okay, which might be true, but it doesn't deal with the real issue of grounding human rights or grounding obligation.
Just because Christianity sounds nice, does it really make it? Does it mean it makes more sense?
No, and I wouldn't want to claim that. If I did claim that in my talk, that's not really intentional. Something sounding nice doesn't mean it makes sense. What I want to say is it makes sense of a particular issue. It makes sense of, say, a particular desire that we have, or a particular kind of conundrum that we come across, like the gap between the good and what makes us happy. And I think Christianity can help make sense of an answer to that. It doesn't guarantee that it's true, but it shows that there's some coherency to the system. There's something appealing about the system, that it helps to make sense of something that we do come across and we do see as a problem. Yeah, that's my short answer.
Yeah. You gave good arguments for a theistic worldview, but most of your argument could also be used for a Islam worldview. How would you distinguish between Christianity and Islam in this topic?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the main answer will be historical, because the differences are, well, there are philosophical claims, like I've kind of hinted at, that the Christian God seems to be more personal. The Christian God is triune, whereas the Islamic God is radically one, radically unitary, and that has interesting philosophical implications which you could explore. But the main difference, of course, is historical. And both religions make historical claims, and the question is, well, which set of claims are more plausible? One difficulty with the Islamic claims is a lot of them are not really testable. The angel Gabriel, I believe, is claimed to have revealed the Quran to Muhammad in a private situation, and then he recited that to other people. There's no real way to test whether that happened. It's all relies on Muhammad's personal word. And the same is true of many religions. Another example is Mormonism and Joseph Smith. It's all about personal revelations to someone who is claiming to be a prophet. A difference with Christianity is that the central events were public, and they were seen by multiple people, and they were persuasive enough to convince people who were skeptical. So it's not just based on the personal trustworthiness of one person, but it's based on a public set of events that a bunch of people saw. So the crucifixion was public. A bunch of people saw it. They knew that he was dead. The Romans were good at killing people, and people saw them do that. The next major event is that Jesus rose from the dead, and he did that publicly. He appeared to people publicly, and this convinced people. And these are the two central events of the Christian message, is that Jesus was dead, but now he is alive. So that's one crucial thing, and you can assess this historically. We have written sources, we can compare, we can work out what's plausible, what's historically plausible, what makes sense in the context. Are there good counterexamples? Is there an alternative claim that makes more sense? A lot of people have tried to refute the resurrection, and there's not a simple answer in response to it. I think the evidence is strong, particularly against the background of the theistic stuff that we've talked about mostly today, that there seems to be evidence for some kind of God. In conjunction with the historical evidence, I think there's a very strong case that the Christian God is true and has revealed himself in Jesus. But this is going to be an historical analysis where we're looking at what do these texts actually say, what do they claim. And there's also issues of, do they claim things that didn't happen in history? And some religions do have that problem. For instance, Mormonism makes a bunch of claims which should have archaeological results, which simply don't match the evidence. Yeah.
Gibt's Fragen aus dem Publikum?
Yes.
My point on the problem of good and evil is that suffering exists because it gives our life purpose, and that is overcoming this suffering. And do you think this matches with the Christian philosophy?
Do you think that is a Christian answer to it, or that's your personal answer to it?
Well, I don't know if it is a Christian
Uh-huh.
view. That's my question.
I would say that's possibly one of the purposes that God has in a particular instance, and we don't really know that. But it's certainly not the full Christian answer. The full Christian answer will involve the fact that humans have messed up before God, that they've they've done some things that are wrong, and that's part of the explanation for why we're kind of out of kilter with the world. We're not really in line with it in the way we should be. So that would be a necessary part of a Christian answer. It's not, yeah. But there will be other elements as well, which we could talk through. But yeah, so that's not going to be a full Christian answer. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sure. So the question is, in terms of the claimed split between the good and what makes us happy, maybe that's true for an individual level, but it doesn't seem to be true at the group level. The problem is that it's the individual who has to make the decision. And my claim is that as a matter of practical rationality, it's not in the individual's interest to necessarily look after the well-being of the group. And also what group? One of the main moral issues is, what about those who are outside my group? How do we treat them? And that's something that is specifically Christian ethic, is something really important to say. And not many people have really touched on that. Most ethics have been in-group ethics. You protect your group, and this makes sense in kind of a survival value. You look after your group, you do the things that help your group survive. And of course, one of the main examples of Jesus' response to this is the story of the Good Samaritan. This is someone who's outside your group, but is still looking after you, that there's still kind of positive interactions and obligations between different social groups. And this is something that's very hard to make sense of in kind of an evolutionary way, where it's, even at the group level, it's about the survival of your group. How to pick that group. And the Christian answer is, at one level, that your group is the whole of humanity, because humanity is all made in God's image. So it's universalizing, it's egalitarian. And if you think you're an egalitarian, you think everyone is equal, there's a Christian basis to that you're going to struggle to find in other worldviews. Got more questions from the floor?
Yeah. One person asked that, how can you claim that science has a Christian history if, for example, the Catholic Church has fought against a lot of scientists and a lot of scientific progress?
Okay, so I think people actually struggle to come up with specific, historically accurate examples of that. There's certainly some myths out there which tend to be kind of exaggerated. So one is the story of Galileo. And a lot of people will think that maybe the Catholic Church tortured him or something, or maybe killed him. There's kind of vague myths out there. And it is true that Galileo got into trouble with the Catholic Church, but it's not a simple matter of science versus religion. So there's a great book on this topic, published by Harvard University Press, called Galileo Goes to Jail, and Other Myths About Science and Religion. And it goes through a bunch of these myths. In the case of Galileo, it was a complicated political situation. He personally insulted the Pope. He called him Simplicius, which means stupid, basically. So in one of his books, he put the words of the Pope, he made this character Simplicius say the words of the Pope. So the stupid character was saying what the Pope was saying, and that offended the Pope, surprisingly enough, and he got into trouble for it. But that wasn't a science-religion thing. Galileo was a committed Catholic his whole life. He believed that the Bible was true, and he believed in God, and so on. Other examples, I don't know, if people want to give me an example, we could see if I know about it, could talk about it. But most of these things are myths, basically. And historians of science religion don't see it as conflict. It's complex, but it's not just conflict. And there's a lot of supporting history that the church and theology and Christians have given to the church, given to science. Sorry. You
say we're broken and cannot fulfill fully trust our senses. Why did God make us broken? What is his advantage of us being broken?
This is I think it's kind of part of the same problem as the problem of evil, of why are there broken things in the world? I don't think God made us broken per se. I think it's tied up with personal choice. And that's going to be a complicated thing. One nice account of this, if you want to read into it, is a book called The End of Christianity by William Dembski. This goes into a particular explanation of how this might have worked out historically. But I think I think G.K. Chesterton said something like, one of the most obvious empirical facts in the world is original sin, that everyone is broken. We recognize it when we interact with people for long enough. We see that that people are not perfect. They don't do what we would like them to do. There's all kinds of brokenness in our society and at an individual level. We don't necessarily know why God allows that, but he has at least given us a solution, which other worldviews don't claim to have. And this is going to be one of the central questions for someone who's considering whether Christianity is actually true, is does it make sense of our brokenness, and does it give an answer to that brokenness? And I think most other worldviews, they actually deny the brokenness, which isn't a good step towards finding an answer to it. Yeah.
When the universe could be different, wouldn't it be more logical to believe in string theory and a multiverse rather than a god?
Okay, so this is a very technical question, which is one of the responses to an argument called the fine-tuning argument, which I didn't actually make today. So it doesn't really work for the contingency argument because, as I understand, the string theory universe could still be different. There's different models of string theory. So even if we did have an account of string theory that worked, let's say somehow that happened, that still wouldn't deal with the contingency question because that model would be contingent. But it does claim to deal with the fine-tuning argument, which is a separate argument that I didn't give. And I will talk through a bit more in my talk on Wednesday. But there are answers to that question as well. One of them is that the suggestion is very hypothetical, and it's hard to see whether it could actually be tested. So there's a lot of leading cosmologists who say this is not really science, it's kind of metaphysics, it's a kind of philosophy, and because it's not testable and they think it's never going to be testable, that they're very suspicious of it. Another answer is something called Boltzmann brains. And in brief, this is the idea that if we were in a multiverse, we would expect our surroundings to look very different. Most observers in a multiverse will observe small universes that have kind of just randomly popped into being and then pop out of existence fairly quickly later. We don't observe that, so that's evidence against a multiverse. Hopefully that's useful to someone who's thinking about the multiverse. You can look it up, Boltzmann brains. And there's lots of discussions of that. And leading people in the field think that that's a reasonable response to the multiverse. So again, it's kind of a stalemate. The multiverse has not obliterated the fine-tuning kind of argument.
Could you explain we're made in the image of God more clearly, maybe through an example or something?
Yeah, so this is an answer for a question for a theologian, really, which I'm not. So through the history of the church, there's a lot of debates. What exactly does image of God mean? Is it a functional question? Is it about the role that we have, that we play the same role as God does? Or is it a question of properties, that we have the same properties as God does, like rationality? So God is rational, therefore we're rational. Or is it God is responsible for the earth, therefore we're responsible for the earth? And I think the answer is it's a mix of these things. So there's a few aspects to the image of God. And one of the key kind of historical backgrounds is apparently in the ancient Near East, kings would set up I think both kings and gods would set up statues as representatives of themselves. Certainly gods would in the ancient Near East. And the statue was seen as the representative of the god in the temple. And the statue could be called the image of that god. So there's an interesting kind of play on words or kind of response to the building of statues to represent God, is that the living God of the Bible doesn't have statues as his image, but he has people as his image. And yeah, there's all kinds of interesting theological stuff there. The kings were thought to be the image of God in some cultures, but the average people weren't. But on the Hebrew view, everyone is in the image of God. So there's not a difference between the average person and the king. That's one important consequence of the idea of the image of God. But yeah, there's lots of stuff there. Ask a theologian for more details.
Isn't the idea of final judgment wishful thinking and therefore an idea of man created?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think one way to answer that is, what reason do I have to believe that there is an afterlife? And the central answer to that will be the resurrection of Jesus. He's the only person who's survived death, as far as we know, through to today. And if the resurrection of Jesus did happen, that's good reason to believe in an afterlife, because Jesus and his followers claim that we can be resurrected with him. So if historically this historical event did happen, kind of breaking the apparent kind of known biological laws of the universe that everyone dies, then it's plausible that God was behind that and that he has put his seal of approval on Jesus' resurrection. And that gives us reason to trust that Jesus' teaching about an afterlife were correct.
Why do you believe God is something is limited? God is unlimited. By personalizing God, we are limiting our understanding to subjective capacities.
So when it comes to God, the best guide is stuff that he said about himself. And apart from stuff that he said about himself, we don't have very much access to who God really is. We have some general concepts that there's some kind of power behind the universe. There seems to be some kind of cause behind our moral obligations. So that gives us a general kind of power. But for what is that power like? We'll need to listen to what God has said, if he's said anything. And that's where the idea of God being personal comes from, in particular, that he has personally revealed himself. So I don't see that as a limitation. I see it just as a fact that he's revealed about himself. And actually, it's a really helpful and important fact, because that means we can relate to him personally. We can actually know this God. It means God's actually relevant to our lives. He's not just an abstract thing that we can ignore. So it's really important in thinking about God to work out, has he said anything? Can we know anything about him specifically?
Less of God is more of atheism. But atheism means believing in nothing. Can you not believe in something which is not God?
So I would say atheism doesn't mean believing in nothing. It just means believing that there is no God. That's the definition of atheism. But if you believe in nothing, then you believe that, even you don't exist. That would be kind of a confusing worldview. It would be hard to do much with that worldview, to go out and live your life if you believe in nothing. So I don't think anyone really believes in nothing. Yeah, any more questions from the floor, responses to what I've said?
How does evolution fit to Christian belief of God's creation?
Come to my talk on Wednesday at lunchtime, and I'm dealing with that in detail. Short answer, I think God has a purpose for the way he made the universe. I think that involved an evolutionary process of some kind. For the details of what I think and what some other Christian scientists think, come to my talk. Hopefully it's interesting.
Different religions develop different practices on getting in touch or unifying with God or absolute truth. Mm-hmm. What is the Christian way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a few ways we could get in connection with God. One of them is prayer. Another one is listening to what he says in the Bible. So listening to his voice, listening to what he said. Essentially, according to Christianity, the way to really get in contact with God is through trusting in Jesus. That Jesus claims to be the universal sacrifice, and if you trust in him, then the properties that God sees in Jesus are attributed to you in some way. And so this is a really kind of intimate connection with God, the way to be known as God's child, personally. So it's a much more personal connection than you get through a lot of religions where you're kind of trying to give God a phone call, kind of trying to get in touch. Sometimes he gets back to you and sometimes he doesn't. The Christian view is much more personal, that you can be personally called a child of God, that the attributes of Jesus can be attributed to you so that you're seen as righteous, for instance, even though you're not, that you can die to yourself and you can be raised again in some sense with Christ, that you can have all the things that Christ has, you can have those personally in God's side. So that, yeah, there's a claim of a really much more personal reality that you can have access to with Christianity that the other religions don't really give you, I think. But if people have questions about that, feel free to come and ask one of the ÖSM people.
Gibt's noch Fragen? Okay, I think we just had this question, but I'm asked, could you give an argument for a personal creator that Christianity claims to have and other religions do not?
It's not really about a separate argument, it's about the strength of the argument. Does the evidence support Christian theism to a greater extent than it supports these other options? And I think it does because Christian theism claims to be particularly personal. So that makes better sense of the personal nature of God choosing a particular universe. It makes better sense of the personal nature of God giving personal moral commands. So because theologically the hypothesis of Christianity is personal, that makes sense of the personal evidence that we see in the world better than the other things. So the evidence supports the Christian version, the Christian claim, more than other claims. That's how I think the argument works. To really, I think, be persuaded, of course, that Christianity is true, you're going to have to deal with Jesus. You're going to have to deal with the historical stuff. But the background philosophy is sometimes helpful for people to see, yeah, it's reasonable to think there is a personal God who might have revealed himself. And that's all that the arguments around a personal creator will get you to.
Unless there are other questions on the floor from the audience right now, otherwise we'd wrap it up. We've worked through all the Mentimeter questions.
Maybe I'll just give a quick summary of what I've said today, just so people have something to think about as they go home.
Feel free to give a summary.
So I've argued that the Christian worldview makes better sense of the personal nature of God and the personal nature of reality in various ways, laws of nature, moral reality. God personally revealed himself in Jesus than naturalism does. It makes far better sense. And that's a good reason that people have to consider Christianity seriously. So hopefully that's thought-provoking for you. And yeah, do feel free to follow it up with questions. Thank you.
Hier ist die Telefonnummer, kommt, wenn man es kriegt, dann ja eben danach veröffentlicht.